Okay, I am very late to the dance on this one. Okay, I needed a bit of a break from discussing Gundam from week to week, so what I decided to do was cleanse my palate a bit. So I've been in a mood to play an RPG, but I couldn't really settle on which RPG I wanted to play because I own way too freaking many. So I figured what I would do is watch the Cyberpunk anime, which is known as Cyberpunk Edgerunners, and kill a couple birds with one stone. Bird number one was seeing if it would put me in the mood to play the game. Bird number two was that I was honestly curious about what everybody else was freaking out about when it came to this anime. I mean, this did get Anime of the Year at the Crunchyroll Awards. Now, after watching all of it, I have to say, Chainsaw Man should have won the award. Alright, video over, hit the music. Alright, Jesus! Alright, I'll give you a more in-depth review. Christ. Okay, all jokes aside, I actually really did like the series, but I wasn't as hyped on it after it was over as everybody else was. It's definitely good. Hell, it's a lot better than most of the isekai garbage that gets pumped out these days. Though I must admit, I'm sort of in a phase where I'm not really much of a big fan of anything modern. Except maybe a few metal bands. So it's kind of rare for a newer piece of media to really crack that shell for me. So I think that it speaks to the quality of the product that I even enjoyed it at all. For those who don't know, Cyberpunk Edgerunners is set in the Cyberpunk universe that was originally created by Mike Pondsmith as a tabletop RPG. It came into pop culture relevance when CD Projekt Red, who had made the Witcher games, announced that they were going to be doing a game with Pondsmith called Cyberpunk 2077. This, of course, was pretty big because CD Projekt Red had done so well with the Witcher series of games, specifically the third one being as huge as it was. And the second bit that garnered a lot of attention is the fact that they were getting Keanu Reeves to do mocap and voice acting for the game. Now that's a smart idea on two levels. And I know I'm breaking a lot of things into two this video, just it's how I do things. The first reason that it was a smart idea was just the simple fact that Keanu Reeves is just as popular now as he was back in the 90s or around the time of The Matrix, which had been late 90s, early 2000s. We can thank John Wick for that. The second reason is that Keanu Reeves has already been in cyberpunk media before, so it just kind of fits. The first time I could think that he did it was the film Johnny Mnemonic, which is one of my favorite films ever for all the wrong reasons. And then you could argue that the Matrix films are cyberpunk, or at least inspired by it. However, sadly, the launch of Cyberpunk 2077 was a freaking disaster. Now, I will freely admit, I pre-ordered the game and I played it on launch and I had a lot of fun with it. But, I can't lie to you, it was riddled with bugs, to the point where a ton of people were refunding the game and CD Projekt Red really had to go back to the drawing board to get everything fixed to a point where people wanted to buy it. If I remember correctly, they even delisted the game in some electronic stores. So, it kind of felt like the name of the game was a bit tainted after all of that. And again, it's nobody's fault but their own. So it was kind of surprising that Studio Trigger said they were going to do an anime based on that exact same cyberpunk universe, and the plot was going to take place 1 year prior to the events of the video game. Caught me out of left field, I won't lie, but it ended up being the perfect thing to wash the taste out of everybody's mouth at the time, at least from my perspective. The story follows the character of David, who is a poor kid that is enrolled in the Arasaka Academy. In the cyberpunk world, Arasaka is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, corporate entities in that world. If you manage to get into their corporate structure, pretty much guarantees you're going to be able to make a good living and live a decent life, if you want to. Never mind the tons of amoral crap that the business does, because it goes without saying that cyberpunk, and kind of the cyberpunk genre in general, is kind of a nihilistic one, where all that really matters is being able to get ahead for yourself. Still, David's mom works herself to the bone as an EMT, and is doing her best to try to get him out of the slums that they live in, out of the ridiculous levels of poverty that are their normal existence. Now, that is not how the show opens, mind you. The opening of the show is actually a massive slaughter. I have to explain a couple of concepts in the cyberpunk universe to explain this opening scene. If you're not familiar with cyberpunk either as a genre or this specific universe, one thing that is common is that people tend to augment their bodies with cybernetics. In this particular universe, if you augment yourself too much, you start to lose a sense of yourself and start losing your sanity. When you go full-on crazy because of this, it's called cyberpsychosis. People who go into this tend to become murderous crazies who go on killing sprees. Oftentimes, these types of psychos can be very difficult to deal with because of, well, how augmented they are. Oftentimes more machine than man. Now, there's a much more in-depth explanation that Mike Pondsmith himself gave on the subreddit called Low Sodium Cyberpunk that I'll have Shirt Dude share a screenshot of right now. So feel free to go ahead and pause the video, read through it so you get a little bit more in-depth than I can get during the course of the video, if you want to, and of course, we'll stop Reddit from getting a bit more traffic. And also, I will say that Pondsmith really does seem like a really cool dude for going out of his way to explain lore like this. But anyway, in this particular case, at the opening of this anime, we have one who is augmented with military hardware and is a former soldier. The key part of his kit, aside from being seemingly bulletproof, is a piece of technology called the Sandevistan, which I could have swore was pronounced Sandevistan, but whatever. My pronunciation's cooler, but I'll go with how the anime does it. This spinal cord implant allows you to move essentially at super speed, and you perceive time as being considerably slower. In the game, I believe that it can range anywhere from being half speed to a quarter speed, which is pretty freaking fast if you think about it. So as you can imagine, this sort of technology is a nightmare to deal with in a fight. The Cyber Psycho manages to kill several police officers in pretty freaking gory ways, but is finally brought down by people that have the hardware just as heavy as he is, that are part of the police force. What we find out later is that David's mom was actually the EMT who picked up the guy's dead corpse for the meat wagon. The reason I bring all that up is because this actually comes into play a little bit later on, but it's meant to set an idea of what cyberpsychosis is in your mind straight out of the gate, because it's a big plot point as the show goes on. And it's something that you see in the game, but I wouldn't say it's a huge plot point. There's side missions where you fight cyber psychos, but none of them are this powerful from what I remember. At least I didn't have too many problems with them. Gorilla hands for the win. Anyway, David himself, going back to him, is a bit of a troublemaker at his school and gets himself into fights with the rich kids. He ends up getting in trouble, and his mother rightfully chastises him while the two are driving down the highway after he tries to shortchange some technology, which screws things up, and now she's got to pay more money. Typical teenager crap, right? Only in a cybernetic universe. Anyway, as they're driving down the highway, they get caught in a random gang fight, and a car accident happens. David's mom is badly hurt, and he simply does not have the funds available that you need to keep someone alive in this universe. They have health insurance, but it seems to be the only thing it covers is the initial surgery and a bed to try to recover in, which she doesn't. Not really a spoiler, it happens in episode 2. Now, that might sound a bit harsh, right? But you see, Cyberpunk is a universe that is pretty exaggerated in how it tries to present capitalism, specifically in the idea that it's possible to actually have health insurance in this particular world and they just let your loved one die because it's not enough. And rather coldly at that. It's just like, oh yeah, you didn't have better insurance, so get fucked. That's not something that really happens in real life, at least not in America. There are reports of similar things, but when you dive into them, it's not really the case. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this is hyper-capitalism as a narrative device to kind of give you an idea of the fact that this is a dystopia. If it's trying to be a critique of actual capitalism, I wouldn't take it seriously personally because it's kind of out of touch. So it works for putting forward a narrative, but it doesn't really work for any sort of allegory to reality unless you're just a crazy person. But anyway, that's enough of the political ranting. Let's just get back to the crazy cyborgs, because we're just all here for shooting robot fun time. Anyway, David finds himself without a mom anymore, but what he also finds in his apartment is that his mom pulled the augment, the I want to say Sandevistan. It sounds cooler if you say Sandevistan, but apparently it's Sandevistan. I'm going to struggle with this the whole video, guys. Don't hold it against me. From the dude's spine. David decides he's going to go and get this thing installed. And he does exactly that in a brutal procedure where he actually has to have his spine removed without anesthesia. Yeah, it's a little bit much there, buddy. Still, he's able to go get his revenge on the kid who bullied him using the Sandevistan to great effect. After that, of course, he gets expelled. And then, in his journeys on trying to find ways to make money out in the world, he meets a very hot number named Lucy, who is the cyberpunk equivalent of a pickpocket. The two team up their abilities to steal some cash, and then the two start bonding. And there's actually a really sweet moment where the two of them use a VR program, essentially, called a brain dance, to go onto the moon together. Again, I'm really oversimplifying it. Play the game, you'll understand what I mean by just like super complex VR. Anyway, the thing is, it turns out that Lucy's actually kind of set him up. And a gang led by a giant brute named Maine isn't too happy that David has the augment that Maine himself had apparently paid to get from David's mother. Now, luckily for David, Maine actually held David's mom in really high regard. So when David offers to join Maine's gang to work off the debt, the two actually reach an agreement. And he becomes David's mentor. Now, what's notable to the gang members is that David is able to use his augment so many times in a single day. You see, before Maine and David meet, he had used the Sandevistan 7 times in a single sitting, whereas most people can't use the Sandevistan more than twice in a day because of all the strain it puts on the body. Needless to say, it seems like David is able to use cyber augments much easier than other people can, which is a trait that Arasaka noticed as well during the event that got David expelled from the academy. Now from here, the best way I could describe a big bulk of this series is that hijinks ensue. The first 5 episodes of this 10-episode series are purely world building and character building, and it admittedly can be pretty slow. Then when you get to episode 6, it seems like they finally find the gas pedal and get this hunk of junk moving. Suddenly, it really sets in that this is the type of universe that anybody can die at in any time, and oftentimes in very brutal fashion. One thing I should mention that I really appreciate about this particular anime is the fact that it's presented like a 90s OVA. See, that's around the time that I started getting into this genre of entertainment, late 90s, early 2000s. Watching things like Genocyber, the Devilman OVAs, Ninja Scroll, Biohunter, and things of that nature. That was around the time when anime was sort of considered here in the US a bit of a wild card around that time because anime was so willing to just push the envelope in regards to violence and sex and things of that nature. And Cyberpunk Edgerunners is honestly presented like those old OVAs, and thank God for it. The attitude towards sex and violence in this particular series is basically that they're going to throw it at you with no apologies. Now, the reason I appreciate that is twofold. Here I go with the twos again. Neither of those appreciations actually have anything to do with the titillation element, oddly enough. Though I can be a bit of a prude, I don't really mind nudity in the arts if it makes sense within the context. And that comes from the first reason that I appreciate this when it comes specifically to how they're doing it in Cyberpunk Edgerunners. Cyberpunk is a universe that is supposed to be blunt when it comes to sex and violence because that's what a good chunk of Night City subsists on. It's supposed to be a place where these sorts of taboos just don't exist if you're part of the gangland life. So from an artistic standpoint, it's perfect because that's how the universe is supposed to be presented. Casual nudity, casual violence, all of that is just part of your existence there. The second reason I really feel like this is a good thing is because I feel like anime needs to have more series like this, or like Chainsaw Man, or Goblin Slayer, and other such mature stories where they're willing to put budget into something that pushes the envelope and presents a much more mature story than a bunch of isekai harems and what have you that ultimately tell you the exact same fucking story over and over again, but with a different set of characters. The other thing that I will give credit to the story on is that it does a pretty good job of establishing characters fast, so at least you get an idea of who these people are as people without having the need for the anime to be double the size that it is. Now granted, the two characters that get the most characterization and time are Lucy and David, because their romance is supposed to be what a good chunk of the plot revolves around. Both of them have something very special about them, but I won't reveal what that is because it's pretty spoiler-tastic, though I already hinted at it with David. However, this is also something that I would say works against the show. You see, because it's a two-character-focused story, And because it's only 10 episodes long, you don't really get to know anybody else. It's really hard to find yourself getting emotionally attached to anyone outside of Lucy and David. So when other characters die in the series, the emotional impact is kind of blunted because you're not really reacting to the fact that this particular person is losing their life. You're reacting to the fact that it's being done in such a brutal method. It's more something that gives you an idea of just how heartless the setting is, as opposed to letting you get emotionally invested in a lot of these characters and then feeling like somebody pulled your goddamn heart out. The reason I bring this up is I need to admit something. I did not get as emotionally impacted during the events of this show like everybody else did. There were interesting plot lines that I was invested in, especially in regards to David and his special abilities, that really just ended up being throwaways, and I was kind of left a bit disappointed. There were a couple others that I won't mention as well, but I will say, of course, I like the characters of Lucy and David, and I like the little gremlin that's known as Rebecca. The thing is, the rest of the characters that are there don't really have a whole lot to them. They're kind of two-dimensional, and because they're lacking in depth, you find yourself not really that surprised when people get betrayed or bad things happen. Granted, part of the reason why I personally might not have had the same emotional response that everybody else did is because I'm already pretty familiar with how bleak Cyberpunk is, both as a universe, in the case of the story, and then as a subgenre of science fiction at large. Most Cyberpunk stories that you encounter are bleak dystopian fiction, where nobody gets out unscathed if they get out alive at all. So in a sense, I kind of went into this expecting it to be dark, I expected it to be violent, I expected it to honestly just kill off characters whenever it was ready to kill them off, and overall just be kind of this dark experience. The other thing that I would put out as a criticism, especially about Studio Trigger, is I'm admittedly not as high on them as I am other animation studios that are out there. One major criticism I would specifically have in this show is they take some shortcuts when it comes to the animation. Specifically, they'll focus on a still frame for way too freaking long during the course of a conversation, and it's really obvious that you're just looking at a JPEG file that's just sitting there in whatever editing software they're using. I hate it when that sort of stuff happens because it's honestly just a cost-cutting measure and it really comes across as cheap. Especially considering the fact that oftentimes the still frames that are being focused on aren't really enhancing the story at all by focusing on it. And this isn't the first time I've seen Trigger do this either. And I honestly wish that whoever the director was on this show would have hammered them about it. Now for a little bit of a rant. This is honestly why I feel like Chainsaw Man got robbed when it comes to anime of the year. Look, I'm sorry folks, but the quiet moments in Chainsaw Man compared to the quiet moments in this anime, you compare the two, Chainsaw Man wins every single frickin' time. It handles intimacy so much better. Not to mention it has more layers of intrigue as a series. It's better about camera angles. It's better about presentation in a lot of ways, so on and so forth. Not to mention, it's just got more layers as a series. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is a very straightforward series, which isn't a bad thing, but I think in comparison to other stories, it works against it. Now, I know some people might think that I'm comparing apples to oranges here, and I admittedly kind of am, because I'm biased. At the same time, even if I set those biases to the side, I still think that Cyberpunk Edgerunners as a story could have been a lot better if it had a couple more episodes to breathe. I would have loved for there to be 2 episodes in the middle of the series that give us a little bit more characterization and then slowly start to add in a little bit more action and a little bit more, so by the time episode 6 comes around and things really start kicking off, the kickoff feels a little bit more natural instead of just coming fast, hard, and heavy. Not to mention a couple of the more intimate scenes with David and Lucy are actually not as impactful as they could be or as intimate as they could be because they're focusing way too much on the size of Lucy's boobs or her surprisingly widening hind end as the series goes on. How her hips, as in her hip bones, grew so much from like episode 4 to episode 6 is beyond me. I'm not quite sure. Now don't get me wrong, she's easy on the eyes. And honestly, I do actually like her character design outside of the rampant nudity. At the same time, I feel like there are points where Studio Trigger is prioritizing titillation over storytelling, and I find it really annoying whenever it comes to setting up romance or fleshing it out even more. Now, the thing is, like, nudity can be used as a tool for showing vulnerability, and when it's used really well, it can actually enhance a scene. I can understand there are moments where David and Lucy are talking in the nude and they're supposed to be like that, but it just doesn't quite hit. I think a lot of it is because they're using wide frame shots, so you see every detail of Lucy's curves, which again is more of a shot used for titillation, than they are focusing on maybe a camera angle that lets you see their moods a little bit better, or present emotions through that sort of cinematography. They just don't do it, and it's unfortunate. Even with my criticisms, though, I still recommend the series. It's way above average. It's just not as good as Chainsaw Man. But anyway, since it's only 10 episodes long, it's not hard to sit through and binge in a day. And it's a lot of fun. And like I mentioned, I love the fact that it's a throwback in a lot of ways to the 90s style of doing anime. And I wouldn't mind seeing Studio Trigger do more side stories for Cyberpunk, just because I think it's a very compelling setting to tell stories in. That's why I liked the video game in the first place, and the show's no different. I just wish they had a little bit more time to keep it in the oven, so to speak. But I will admit that my complaints might not really matter as much to other people as they do to me. Hey, look! A critic being honest about his biases and keeping them as a factor when he reviews things instead of acting like he's the authority on everything. And it's not really that hard to do either. It's called journalistic ethics, folks. And it ain't that hard. Jim.
He's fat!
So to close this one out, I really don't think we need a spoiler section for this one, because I would much rather you just watched it. I feel like this is such a short show that if I went into spoiler time, I honestly think that I wouldn't really be leaving you much to watch. Not to mention, as good as the show is, I wouldn't call it deep. It's a very personal story about a couple of characters that I honestly don't feel are super complicated people. It's the anime equivalent of comfort food. If you're looking for something that has a ton of flavor delivered very quickly in a satisfying manner, that has a good ending, a great way to wrap it up, I very much recommend it. However, since it's a Netflix exclusive, all I have to say is, I didn't forget about cuties. I just did what I wanted because a you-know-what is free. Yar har diddly dee. If you enjoyed the review, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, a big thank you to all of our patrons, and if you'd like to become one yourself, you got the option of using either Patreon or Subscribestar, link in the description. If you're looking for some good reading, I've got the hookup. My very first novella, American Monsters, is now funded on Indiegogo, so thank you all for that. And that, as of right now, is the only place you can get the book. Plus, if it reaches its stretch goals, it's going to get more stories added to the book, and those extra stories would not be part of a retail version if I were to take this book to retail. So, keep that in mind. If you haven't backed it yet, you're building towards getting more stuff together as a community. Also, my dark fantasy horror comic book, 3 Nights, 4 Days Part 2, is still available for pre-order as well. Anyway, on that note, guys, my name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla, and I will see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.